Greetings, friends, and welcome. I am Ambakisye-Okang, the host of kmtyw towards Pan-Afrikan Economics, a weekly podcast and video program dedicated to making plain the economic dimensions of the lives of Africans, of the continent and the global African diaspora. And I am coming to you with today's Pan-Afrikan Dispatch. Now, as we prepare to enter the third decade of the 62nd century since the archaeologically confirmed establishment of the Kushite Kemet solar calendar in the year 4241 before the Common Era, we as global African peoples, if we have begun the process of re-Africanization and view the world through an African consciousness or worldview, and analytically consider our socio-political economic condition, will cogently arrive at the conclusion that we reside in a spiritual, cognitive, affective, and psychomotor physiological socio-cultural crisis. Our socio-political economics, culture, and socio-historical consciousness exists at a critical point, a figurative crossroads defined by dire epistemological and ontological difficulties, and subsisting of existential catastrophes that place the potential resurgence and expansion of African high culture and the optimal continuation of African biological life at perhaps the nadir, near a point of no return from the abyss of conquest, subjugation, and exploitation that has, with interludes of respite, plagued global African peoples for 2.5 millennia. The extremity of the socio-political economic crisis of global African peoples is systemic and thus impacts all aspects of African life. By way of example, at no time in the history of global African peoples has the military differential between global Africans and Eurasians been at its current levels, whereby the scale of weaponry possessed by Eurasian nations is at a magnitude where they are capable, if so choosing, of eradicating global African peoples from the face of the earth, with not the least bit of concern of preventative strategies or retaliation being implemented by global African nations. For global African nations have not, for the last half millennia, engaged in the domestic research, development, and production of technologically innovative military hardware. Instead, purchasing subpar weaponry from the Eurasian nations in numbers and capabilities sufficient not for offensive maneuvers, but for the neo-colonial comprador continued subjugation of global African populations. This allusion to military differentials and thus warfare is by no means accidental, for it is an apt way to begin an analysis of the global African predicament that derives from nearly 3 millennia of Eurasian domination of global African peoples. It takes us directly into the heart of the implementation strategy of Eurasian nations. The use of overwhelming military force in warfare or international political interaction, that is, diplomacy by aggressive means. To effect a public policy of domination, Eurasian powers resort to a socio-political economic strategy of violence. Violence, the result of the socio-political economic use of subversive and devastating spiritual, cognitive, affective, and physiological coercive power in the social harassment, political intimidation, and economic oppression of a people is an infringement upon the cultural standards of a people, an egregious violation of the sacred customary laws of the great ancestral founders of a nation, and a means of destroying the socio-political economic harmony and love of a people for themselves. The following description of this violent condition, as presented by ancestor Malcolm X in his autobiography, though describing the American African socio-political economic condition over half a century ago, is widely applicable to the current socio-political economic circumstances of global African peoples and nations. All of us, pimps, prostitutes, drug users and dealers, alcoholics, etc., who might have probed space or cured cancer or built industries, were instead black victims of the white man's American social system. In the ghettos the white man has built for us, he has forced us not to aspire to greater things, but to view everyday living as survival. And in that kind of community, survival is what is respected. The black prisoner symbolized white society's crime of keeping black men oppressed and deprived and ignorant and unable to get decent jobs, turning them into criminals. The white man wants black men to stay immoral, unclean, and ignorant. As long as we stay in these conditions, we will keep on begging him and he will control us. We never can win freedom and justice and equality until we are doing something for ourselves. These are the words of ancestor Malcolm X, written in 1964. Ignorance perpetrated through cultural misorientation, compulsory subpar miseducation, and internal ghettos or colonies within the Eurasian nations, and nigger boxes or neo-colonial flag independent states of continental Africa and the Caribbean are key components in the continued oppression of global African peoples to this day, as they are the established socio-economic and socio-political structures that murder global African peoples by the hundreds of millions. And yes, we are referring to so-called African nations as nothing more than nigger boxes or neo-colonial flag independent states, as they do not have economic freedom, they have not been economically liberated, and therefore they have little more than a shoddy political independence. The spiritual, cognitive, affective, and psychomotor physiological enslavement and colonization of global African men, women, and children for forced labor and sexual trafficking in this day have historically been, and contemporarily are, socioeconomic institutions which were historically and currently are supported by socio-political institutions and murder millions through socio-political economic violence. The socio-political economic policies supported by political violence or the threat thereof, which allowed the ruthless exploitation and murder of billions across the world by market-oriented multinational corporations and political elite collaborators in all countries, is yet another example of how so-called legal structures can be and generally are sadistically violent. These culturally unjust socio-political economic systems can be as violent, if not more, than rampaging ideologically deficient armies. For it is, as Jacques Ellul explained in his book, Propaganda, the Formations of Men's Attitudes, unjust economic systems can be as violent as rampaging armies. All kinds of violence are the same. The violence of the soldier who kills, the revolutionary who assassinates. It is true also of economic violence, the violence of the privileged corporate owner against his workers, of the haves against the have-nots. The violence done in international economic relations between Western nations and those of the developing world. The violence done through powerful corporations which exploit the resources of a country that is unable to defend itself. This is a socio-political economic situation of depopulation by Europeans, that is, white privilege, that morally requires revolution against the established order, the criterion of a living faith. The affluence of the Eurasian nations depends on the poverty and unjust socio-political economic structures that make the Eurasian nation elites of the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Western and Eastern Europe, China, Japan, the two Koreas, etc., and the socio-political economic comprador black elites of neo-colonial Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and those black bourgeois or black Anglo-Saxons of the internal colonies within the Western nations of Canada, the United States, and the United Kingdom, wealthy, and the grassroots of the external and internal neo-colonies, generally in a state of disease, malnourishment, and impoverishment. As an example, land throughout the areas of the Global South is used to grow export crops to sell to Western nations, rather than being used to feed the grassroots and the home countries, since the global socio-political economic system is facilitated by a price methodology. Even the grassroots and internal colonies of the Western nations participate, by their consumption-based lifestyles, in the socio-political economic structures, which are blindly followed. They participate in those institutions which support this unsustainable lifestyle, such as the political system which they maintain by cooperating in system preservationist symbolic pseudo-politics, thus engaging in ritualistic murder. All of this, even while professing in the main to be Christians, but ignoring the words of their own religious doctrines as found in the Isaiah scrolls. Woe to those who decree iniquitous decrees, and the writers who keep writing oppression, to turn aside the needy from justice, and to rob the poor of my people of their right, that widows may be prey, and that they may rob the fatherless. From the book of Isaiah, chapter 10, verses 1 through 4. And that ends today's Pan-Afrikan Dispatch. A luta continua, pamoja tutashinda.